Welcome to Seems Like History, Episode 4, Mittie Barrier's Barnyard Quilts, 1917 and 1920. My name is Loretta Allen, and welcome to the fourth episode of Seems Like History. I am a writer, independent researcher, and amateur quilt historian. In each episode of this podcast, I take a look at one quilt, the artist who made it, and the world as she knew it. If you feel the need to hear a brief history of quilting, you can find that at the beginning of episode 1. And I have to take just a second here to apologize for how long it took me to get this episode out, but I had to have major dental stuff done all last week. So yeah, kind of threw me off and it wasn't fun. So I thank you for your patience. So you may not think that a square of cloth and some stitches have much to say about history, but you'd be surprised. So come along with me as I take us to Rowan County, North Carolina, and we drop in on rural life in the early 20th century and take a look at two creatively original quilts made by a young woman named Mittie Barrier, who created two masterpieces as whimsical and humorous as she was. The European settlement of North Carolina was made by many different people, but the German and Scots-Irish were the early prominent settlers. Most of them traveled down the wagon road in a Conestoga wagon from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, but of course, settlers could enter the Great Wagon Road from any point along the way. They brought many of the things they would need to set up their homestead with them, like cattle and grains. Land in and around Philadelphia had become expensive, and fewer acres were available to new immigrants or for burgeoning families. North Carolina offered them more room, and the land was half as expensive. The journey down the wagon road was exhausting and perilous. It extended 800 miles from Philadelphia to Georgia. In Roanoke, Virginia, the road split, one half going on to what is now Kentucky and the other further south into what is now North Carolina and eventually ending in Georgia. In the days before the arrival of Europeans, the wagon road was originally an ancient trading route of the Native Americans, later called Warrior's Path, and it connected the Iroquois people in the north to the Cherokee in the south. The town of Salisbury in Rowan County, North Carolina, was established in 1753. It would have been nearly impossible to do so without the use of the wagon road. In terms of quilting, Mary Mittie was born smack in what is known now as the crazy quilt fad. Mary Mittie, who was forever known as Mittie, was born on the 4th of February, 1894 in Rowan County, North Carolina. Two of her quilts, in my opinion, are prime examples of what we call American folk art. Mittie was born to James Agner and Joyce Morgan, both lifelong residents of North Carolina whose ancestry was a mixture of the Scots-Irish and German settlers, with a little Welsh and Swiss thrown in for good measure. Just 30 years before Mittie was born, her grandfather Henry had survived a POW camp during the Civil War. By the time Mittie was born, her ancestors had been in Rowan County for several generations. Taking a look at the world in 1894, we see rapid industrialization spreading throughout the globe. A sense of wonder permeated the population as inventions like the moving picture and the automobile not only made the world seem smaller, but they made anything seem possible. Grover Cleveland was the president of the United States at the time, and he had his hands full navigating the fallout of the economic crisis from just the year before in 1893. While at least 75% of America's population still lived in rural areas and small farms in 1894, the migration toward city living was about to ramp up. This was also the era known as the Gilded Age. At the expense of the average citizen paid in blood, sweat, tears, and toil, the rich kept getting richer. They made more money shaking hands, moving money around, and signing contracts than the people who were doing the backbreaking labor. And when there was an economic downturn, the lives of the rich were barely impacted, while the lives of the poor were devastated. And while Mittie's family probably felt the impact of the economic panic of 1893, the family farm offered some insulation against economic catastrophes. Farmers were often cash poor and did daily backbreaking labor, but they were mostly self-sufficient. Aside from things like sugar and fabric and tools, the families who lived on farms produced everything else. Some families achieved this on as little as 40 acres. As long as they could pay the taxes to keep to keep the farm and make needed repairs, the farm itself assured them that they'd at least have food. City dwellers at the turn of the 20th century, whose existence depended completely on their paycheck, were not even guaranteed food in times of economic despair. In the 1900 census, Mittie was a 6-year-old girl living with her mom, dad, older sister Laura, younger brother David Calvin, and baby sister Willie. They lived about 11 miles southeast of Salisbury on a winding country lane, quaintly named Bringle Ferry Road. They lived among green fields and mimosa trees interspersed with the farms and houses of their neighbors. Those neighbors were usually related in some way or another, either by marriage or by blood, or they'd just been acquainted with each other for generations. At the center of that community was the church. Mittie's family attended the St. Matthew's Lutheran Church, which had been established at the intersection of Bringle Ferry Road and what became known as St. Matthew Church Road. In the early days, the congregants gathered in a barn under a walnut tree, and then eventually they got a more permanent building. The cornerstone of the current building was laid in 1882, and Mittie would be a lifelong, very active member of St. Matthew's. In 1903, about 5 hours to the east of where 9-year-old Mittie lived with her family, 2 men from Ohio would change the world in a place called Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. Orville and Wilbur Wright, 2 brothers who owned a bicycle repair shop in Dayton, Ohio, were obsessed with the idea of creating a device that could carry human beings safely through the air and travel great distances. The machine needed to be able to lift off the ground, travel while suspended in the air, make turns, and then land safely with the occupant and the plane intact. The Wright brothers created what would become known as the Wright Flyer in secret, and then they took that to the Outer Banks to test drive their new invention because they needed a place with lots of sand for crash landings. On December 17th, with Orville in the seat, the Wright brothers' first attempt at flight in this new plane lasted 12 seconds and flew 120 feet. On the 4th flight of that day, they were able to fly a half mile. By 1905, the 3rd version of their Wright Flyer would make a 39-minute sustained flight. Airplanes would eventually lead to mankind having the ability to travel around the globe in less than a day, and it would even lead to mankind leaving the Earth altogether and flying to the moon and back. But a decade after that very first 12-second flight, empires would use that flight technology for aerial mapping and bombing in the First World War. And while there were many contributors to this newfound technology, none of us create in a vacuum, right? 2 brothers with humble beginnings and no college education changed everything. By 1910, Mittie's mother and father had added 4 more children to the family. Mittie's role as one of the older children of a large family was to take care of the younger children while her mother cooked, cleaned, and did other chores. And since Mittie's father took a job as a mail carrier that year, that meant her help was needed even more. In 1912, Mittie's older sister Laura married David Barrier, and Mittie was one of her bridesmaids. This left Mittie, the oldest child, at home with her parents and younger siblings. The Salisbury newspapers in 1914 contained articles and announcements about dry goods companies and where to buy ladies' boots and complaints that the new telephone was taking over the telegraph. But there was one headline that struck fear among all the residents. Halfway around the world, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie triggered a landslide of alliances among countries, and war was declared. Americans held their breath, worried that President Wilson would throw in his support behind Great Britain and take us to war. And much like the sanitary fairs during the Civil War did, the American Red Cross sprang into action all over the country, calling for the average citizen to help the soldiers by making quilts and knitted items like hats, scarves, and mittens. And in 1917, when Mittie was just 23 years old, she started work on the first of 2 folk art quilts. Mittie's first quilt, dated 1917 in big numbers, is a type of crazy quilt. Vintage crazy quilts and pictorial quilts are my absolute favorite types of quilts because they tell a story. They are a glimpse into the life and personality of the maker, and in some cases, it's a reflection of the world at the time. So I can't talk about Mittie's quilts without first giving a brief history of the crazy quilt. In episode 1 of this podcast, I talked about what makes a quilt. The fabric sandwich of a backing, batting in the middle, and then the decorative top that are then quilted together with a running stitch. Crazy Quilts came along and sort of threw all of that out on its ear. In fact, there are still quilt shows today that won't allow crazy quilts into the competitions because they don't consider them, quote, real quilts. And why is that, you ask? Well, because the quilt police are cranky, that's why. And because crazy quilts generally have only 2 layers, the top and the back. And they aren't quilted in the traditional sense either. Some are just tacked in convenient spots with the knot showing on the back side of the quilt. While sometimes the 2 layers of the crazy quilt are quilted, but it's very minimal, so as not to take away from the embroidery on the top. And crazy quilts are usually just for show. Most are not functional. What really sets crazy quilts apart from, quote, regular quilts is the fact there is no real pattern. A true blue crazy quilt has no rhyme or reason to where the patches of fabric are laid. The random shapes and irregular size patches are either sewn together or sewn down on a foundation fabric, which could be anything from, like, usually a thin muslin or even an old sheet. And instead of using one type of fabric like just cotton or just wool or just silk, the crazy quilt will take all of those fabrics mixed together, plus throw in linen, brocades, and the kitchen sink. Okay, that's an exaggeration, but in future episodes, I'll show you what weird things were put on some crazy quilts. So after the foundation of irregular patches are made, then the fun begins, because then you get to embellish and decorate all those seams with ribbons, lace, beads, buttons, and elaborate decorative embroidery stitches. After the top is all done, you can then decide how you want to finish it off by either doing small quilt stitches in secretive strategic places or by tacking it and knotting your thread on the back side of the quilt. Then you bind it using your favorite method. The ladies of the Victorian era went wild for this new way to show off their needle and embroidery skills, and it was a creative way to use up their scraps. Most of all, it allowed them creative freedom on a level that pieced geometric quilts did not. So I'll go into a more in-depth history of the crazy quilt in episode 5. But for this episode, and for Mittie Barrier's part in this story, what you need to know is that the height of the crazy quilt fad was from about 1880 to 1920, and it swept the entire country. Mittie got in on the action just as the fad was winding down. She originally had the idea to make some embroidered pillows, but at the last minute, she decided to make a quilt instead. Mittie's quilt from 1917 isn't a typical crazy quilt either. She made what is known as a contained crazy quilt. There might be other terms for it as well, but a contained crazy is essentially when you create order out of the chaos. In other words, you contain your crazy patches in a block of some sort, like a square or maybe diamonds. Mittie confined hers in squares. In the 1917 quilt, there are 6 rows of 6 blocks with a small border of crazy patch on the bottom row. Within the confines of those blocks, each one is set up with a similar structure of one long rectangle piece in the middle, where she showcased a scene from her life on the farm. And then around that rectangle are smaller pieces of fabric to finish off the square shape. In the top row, Mittie made a block devoted to stitched roses, a block full of embroidered butterflies in flight, one devoted to 2 lambs, a block where 2 cardinals roost on trees, 3 daffodils coming up out of the ground, and then the last block is a stitched eagle. All the rectangles that hold the individual motifs are also decorated with embroidery stitches like the Cretan stitch, the herringbone stitch, the fly stitch, and various combinations. The second row of the 1917 quilt has a block with some pansies, and then the next one has roses, and one of my favorite blocks is of 6 geese going in various directions. The geese are made with a weave stitch that gives them a 3-dimensional look. In the block next to the geese are squirrels, and then a block of hollyhocks and a block full of daisies. Row 3 is more flowers, with the 3rd block showcasing birds at a bird bath, and then next to it is a square of adorable spotted bunny rabbits and baby chicks with the words Happy Easter embroidered in a chain stitch. Next to that, there are more flowers. The first block in row 4 was left empty. It's not known if she was keeping it open to add something later, or if she just wanted to finish the darn quilt and had run out of ideas. The rest of row 4 is mostly flowers, with 2 cardinals in a basket with a nest full of eggs. Then there's a block with a dog and 2 geese, and a block with ripened red cherries. Row 5 are roses, more roses, and then a block with 3 bunnies. 2 of them are also spotted. Next is a block devoted to 3 geese, and then the block that lets us know what year the quilt was made. The large numbers, 1917, are satin stitched and surrounded by lots of decorative stitching. In the final row, we get more flowers. We've got tulips standing jauntily in a row, a block with 2 bluebirds, and then another block with her whimsical geese, one of which is in flight. Most of the fabrics used in this amazing quilt were scraps. She used leftover fabrics from men's jackets and pants and coats. Most of it is wool, but some of it is silk. But almost all the time, the central piece of fabric that houses the embroidered motif is a dark solid. The embroidery is done with bright colored threads so that it really pops against that dark fabric. She drew the motifs for this quilt onto paper, placed the paper on the fabric, and then stitched through the paper and the fabric. And when she was done, she tore the paper off, revealing the motif beneath. She bought her embroidery thread at the dime store for a nickel a ball. The binding on the quilt is a deep maroon or burgundy. Mittie explained later that the embroidered motifs on the quilt were inspired by the things she saw every day on her farm. One has to wonder if the eagle was a regular visitor to her home or if she chose the eagle specifically to represent the United States, a gesture to the local boys who were being drafted as we entered World War I. This quilt is now housed at the McKissick Museum in Columbia, South Carolina. World War I must be one of the most devastating events in all of human history. It would take me 3 hours to go into all the history that led up to the war, so I'll try to compress it into a few paragraphs. By 1914, when the war began, Europe was a land of empires who were looking to expand their territorial acquisitions, or at the very least, not lose what they already had. The British Empire is a good example of this. There they were, living on their little island, when suddenly they thought, no, we need land elsewhere. So they colonized what's now the United States, which ended badly for them. They colonized Australia, Canada, Hong Kong, and eventually parts of India and beyond. But they weren't the only European empire to do this. Austria had branched out, taking Hungary and part of the Balkans. The Ottomans held parts of Greece and Africa. France had huge holdings also in Africa. And at one time, we can't forget the Spanish, right? At one time, Spain had large swaths of land in North and South America. Almost 2 million Spaniards immigrated to the Americas, but by 1825, they had lost control of most of their holdings there, and what little they did have left, they lost in 1898 to the U.S. in the Spanish-American War. So Spain was in absolutely no position to fight in 1914, and they remained neutral. But Germany, well, Germany wasn't having much luck finding countries that weren't already conquered, although they did gain new territories in China and the Pacific, but nothing like the size of the holdings of, say, France, Russia, Great Britain, or even the U.S. Kaiser Wilhelm II looked at his position on the map as quite precarious. France lay to the west, and Russia wasn't too far away to his east, and both were allied with each other. In other words, both had sworn to come to the other's help if needed. And why do leaders want to colonize or control other countries in the first place, you might ask? Well, usually it's because they want to plunder the natural resources of that country and have the use of their people as a free workforce. It's a numbers game, honestly. Like, who has the most acreage? Who has the largest population available to work for them? How valuable are the natural resources in that area? And not one shred of thought is given to the culture and the people who already live there, much less the thought of sharing any of that revenue from that exploitation with the native population. In 1914, 3 of the imperial leaders, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, and King George V of Great Britain, were all first cousins. The hope was that intermarriages somehow assured that no matter how the chips fell, the same people would remain in positions of power. In the southern area of Europe known as the Balkans, Slavic Serbs sought independence from the Austria-Hungarian Empire. Tensions between Serbia and Austria grew. So when Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie went to inspect imperial troops in Sarajevo in 1914, a Serbian nationalist assassinated him and his wife. Germany, who had been itching for a way to expand their borders, agreed to help the Austrians if they declared war. And that's exactly what happened. Russia, predictably, threw in their lot with the Serbs and Balkan states. France, of course, backed Russia because they were allies. Great Britain declared war on Germany because they were allies of the French and the Russians. On the German and Austrian side were the Bulgarians and the Ottomans. And for the first few years of the war, President Wilson and the U.S. took the stance of isolationism. We don't care what's going on over there. It's not our fight. And for the most part, it wasn't. However, we had to realize that whoever came out on top of that war would be a power that we would have to deal with in the future. So it was in our best interest that victory went to our friends. So without actually declaring war, the U.S. tried to help by sending supplies on a regular basis to Great Britain and France. And since Germany was fighting a war on two fronts, you'd think they would have been a little more particular about whose boats they sunk, but they weren't. With the sinking of the Lusitania that killed over 100 Americans, the U.S. began to wonder if we could stay out of this Euro cage match for much longer. The war in Europe ground to a halt along the French and German border, where literally thousands of men would die every day for no reason whatsoever. On one day, 21,000 men died just to advance the territorial line by 1 mile. 1 mile. 21,000 men. A sudden overthrow of the Russian government by their subjects threw everything into chaos and resulted in the exile and execution of the Tsar and his whole family. Again, lots of things led to the Russian Revolution, but the straw that broke the camel's back was their involvement in World War I. Russians were starving, and their men were dying by the thousands every day. With Russia bowing out of the conflict, things were looking up for Germany. However, things were looking horrible for the French. The rate in which France was losing young men was astronomical. Some historians believe that if the war had gone on another 2 or 3 years, the French would have literally run out of eligible fighting men. These empirical leaders didn't care one bit how many bodies they had to throw at their enemies. By the time the war was over, many wondered why it had even happened at all. But when a telegram meant for the leader of Mexico was intercepted by the British, everything changed. In the telegram, the German leaders promised Mexico that they would eventually help them regain the territory of California, Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico from the U.S. if they would agree to keep us busy by invading. President Wilson now had the reason he needed to get in the fight. And just like that, the draft was implemented in the United States because we didn't really have a standing army at the time. In Mittie's hometown and county, hundreds of men would be drafted. Among those was her younger brother, David Calvin Agner. Her brother's name appeared in the newspaper in June of 1917 that he was to report for the draft. In February of 1918, Mittie's brother was called in for his physical exam. He was then shipped off to Camp Hancock in Georgia in July 1918 with 43 other men from Rowan County. The first American troops had already arrived in France the month before and suffered heavy casualties at their first battle. It looked as though Mittie's brother David Calvin would be on the front lines soon. As 1917 passed into history, the world hoped that 1980 would bring good tidings and maybe, finally, some peace. But unfortunately, along with the war in Europe, the world now had to deal with the new influenza epidemic that I literally don't have time to go into. So I'll save that for another episode. But the Rowan County newspapers were full of articles on how to wash your hands and avoid sick people. Coughs and sneezes spread diseases, one paper said. Between World War I and the influenza pandemic that left millions dead, an entire generation were traumatized by their losses. Despite everything, the quilters of Rowan County shined. In September of 1918, the Rowan County newspapers were full of columns dedicated to the war effort. One article said, quote, "Attention Red Cross members. All the women who are interested in piecing quilts for the base hospital are asked to come to the workroom on Tuesday. The allotments for garments and surgical dressings have not come in, so we will piece quilt. Won't you come and help? They are badly needed." In an article dated a few days later, the Salisbury Post reported on that event, quote, "Instead of working with white surgical dressings, a regular old-time quilting party was in progress. 3 tables were piled high with multicolored rags, which some women tore into strips, and others arranged these strips into the well-known log cabin designs." Later that month, an article appeared about Mrs. Robert M. Davis, who sent a quilt that her mother had made when she was over 80 years old. It was the last quilt her mother ever made, but she found it gratifying to know that it went to a soldier. In October of 1918, the Rowan County Red Cross sent a box of 47 quilts overseas after adding 3 beautifully embroidered quilts to the collection. In the first week of November, the Red Cross of Rowan County sent a box of 56 quilts to Army hospitals. The Salisbury chapter of the Red Cross sent a box of 10 woolen quilts, elaborately stitched, showing, quote, "taste and ingenuity." Those are just the highlights, and those are just from the various Red Cross chapters within Rowan County. All across the country, these same acts of kindness and solidarity occurred. In addition to finished quilts being made for the Army hospitals or to be shipped overseas, World War I and Red Cross signature quilts were made to raise money for the war effort. For those fundraiser quilts, a person could pay 5 or 10 cents for their spot on the quilt. Then they would sign a block and either embroider it themselves or one of the quilters would embroider it. In this way, each quilt could bring in hundreds of dollars. On November 11th, 1918, Mittie and her family got wonderful news. The war had officially ended in Europe when a ceasefire was called and a treaty was signed. As luck would have it, Mittie's brother David Calvin Agner was on a ship just days from landing in France when he got the news that the war was over. Her brother came home alive and well the following spring in 1919. Amongst all that craziness of a world at war, local boys shipping out, including Mittie's brother, and the influenza epidemic, life went on. Mittie's younger sister Willie married George Kessler in December 1917. George, too, had been called up to serve and was training at Camp Jackson in South Carolina at the time of their nuptials. George wore his uniform to the wedding, while Willie wore a gown of beautiful silk. By 1920, life had returned to normal on the farm on Bringle Ferry Road. Mittie, now 26 and still single, had settled into a rewarding life helping with the younger siblings and being enamored with all the flowers and animals on her farm. At this point, Mittie decided to make a second quilt. This one would become known as the Barnyard quilt, and it now resides at the North Carolina Museum of History. Believe it or not, the stitching on the 1920 quilt is even more elaborate than on the 1917 quilt. This time, Mittie contained her crazy in blocks, but she also turned them on point. The very first block in the top row she embroidered with the year 1920 in big numbers. Years later, Mittie embroidered her initials MAB above the year. We know this was done later because in 1920 she hadn't yet married, and MAB stands for Mittie Barrier. In 1973, she also embroidered a dedication on the quilt, "To Kathy from Grandmother Mittie, January 17, 1973. The quilt measures 71 by 80 inches and was made from fabric scraps and recycled clothing. While one gets the feeling that Mittie learned quite a bit from making the first quilt, and it shows in the stitching, Mittie herself preferred the one she made in 1917. The first row of the 1920 quilt has a block with some amazing gray squirrels eating acorns. She couldn't find an embroidery thread that was the right color, so she used some of her dad's old socks to get the color and texture just right. The next block over is a beautiful pulsating Christmas star. The block next to that contains an adorable bird's nest cradled among yellow flowers with 2 bluebirds about to touch beaks. In the second row, Mittie stitched 4 pigeons, each with different colored feathers. Mittie would say later that if she had to do it over, she wouldn't make the pigeons quite so big, but I love them the way they are. In the next block, we get geese standing on a creek bank with ducks floating down a stream. Another bird's nest is after that. In the third row, we have 5 finches, or I don't know, maybe they're sparrows, seated on flower stems. In the next block, a white horse stands among the chickens and roosters. The rooster, by the way, is half as tall as the horse. This only makes me love this quilt even more. The next block over is more roosters and chickens with rabbits, and finally 2 horses fill out that row. In row 4, there are 5 geese all lined up in a row in one block, and in the next block, there are 2 geese standing on one side of the creek with 2 alligators on the other side. The geese are bigger than the gators, and in case you're wondering, no, there were no alligators on her farm. The last block in the row is yet more geese, 4 of them this time, with a crescent moon hanging low in the sky. Row 5 starts with 2 birds in a tree, a block with chickens and a goat, then more chickens in the next block, and the last motif is of 2 multicolored bunny rabbits with a basket of eggs. Row 6 has more hens and chicks, more horses in the middle, and a block with 2 pigeons. The final row starts with 2 birds in flight, a block full of songbirds, 2 brown birds with a nest surrounded by red flowers, and lastly, 2 cardinals sitting in a tree. Once again, each individual block is outlined with elaborate embroidery stitches. This quilt is an absolute joy to behold, and so was Mittie. Love finally found her in 1923 when Mittie married Mittie Barrier. For the first time in her life, Mittie left the farm she loved so much to move to another county and help Fletch with his parents. The couple moved in with Fletch's parents and started their own family. A daughter was born in 1924 and a son in 1929. In 1934, Mittie's father retired as a mail carrier, and by 1940, Mittie and Fletch were back in Rowan County, living with her parents back on the family farm. The intergenerational living arrangements that were common back then are obvious. Listed with Mittie's parents in the 1940 census are Fletch, whose occupation was a truck driver, Mittie, their 2 children, aged 15 and 11, Mittie's brother James, a mill worker, aged 32, and his wife and their daughter, and Mittie's sister Zella, aged 30. In 1946, Mittie and her siblings lost their beloved father at the age of 77. At the time of his death, James Agner had 23 grandchildren and 8 great-grandchildren. 3 years later, in 1949, when Mittie and her siblings threw a Mother's Day celebration for their mother Joyce, the newspapers reported that there were now 24 grandchildren and 17 great-grandchildren. In 1950, the census records show that the inhabitants in the 2-story house on Bringle Ferry Road were Fletch, Mittie, their 2 children, Mittie's mother Joyce, aged 81, Mittie's brother James, and his son. Fletch was listed as working for the state highway. Unfortunately, tragedy would strike later that year when Fletch died in a work-related accident. Mittie never remarried, but she lived the next couple of decades fully engaged with the farm, her family, the garden, and her church. The papers frequently list her name as hosting events at the church, taking trips to Greensboro with her sister Laura, as a member of the Liberty Extension Homemakers Club, and an attendee of the adult Sunday school. Mittie remained close to her siblings as most of them all settled in the surrounding area. Mittie would end up surviving both of her children, but she kept going. She kept doing good for the community and her grandchildren. Through the years, her children and grandchildren loved to play on the barnyard quilts and talk to the embroidered animals. Mittie didn't pack her amazing quilts away. She put them on her bed and used them. In the 1970s, Mittie had her 15 minutes of fame when her barnyard quilts unexpectedly drew attention. Mittie ended up entering her quilts in 4 county fairs and took first place in each one. She almost didn't enter the quilt in the competitions because of those darned pigeons that she'd made as big as her horses. Lucky for us, she did. In 1974, the Salisbury Post ran an article about Mittie and her life and her barnyard quilts. At the age of 70, Mittie told the reporter that she still saw her siblings on a daily basis. She also told the reporter that she'd torn up a pair of stockings that spring, trimming up the brush, and she still had chickens in the coop. Quote, "Everything on the quilt was in our yard but these 2 alligators," she said in the interview. She didn't remember all those years later why she put the alligators on the quilt. Just a whim of the moment, she said. And these weren't the only 2 quilts that she'd made in her life. Mittie told one newspaper reporter that she was starting to give away all her other quilts at wedding and baby showers. She even explained how on one occasion they had a quilting party and they had a quilt up in every room of the house except the kitchen. They made 10 quilts that day. And just on a side note, if you have a quilt made by Mittie and have a photo of it, I would love to see it. Mittie enjoyed the spotlight, but she was also a bit baffled by all the attention. When a stranger called or knocked on her door, the first words out of her mouth were, "Are you here to see my quilts?" Throughout the 1970s, her quilt would be displayed in different shows and exhibits throughout the state. Mittie Barrier passed away in 1977 at the age of 83. She was buried in the cemetery across the road from St. Matthew's Church, where she'd been a lifelong member. Her sister Laura had passed away a few years before her, but 3 of her sisters and 3 of her brothers survived her. One of those brothers was David Calvin, the one who had been shipped off to France during World War I. Calvin not only outlived her, but he lived to be 100 years old, passing away in 1996. If he'd made it to France a little sooner, there's a good possibility he would have come home in a pine box. How many of those young men who died in Europe could have gone on to live to be 90 or 100 like David Calvin if emperors hadn't used them like pawns on a game board? The Cemetery of St. Matthew's tells a story. It tells the story of a time and a place where family put down roots and stayed, when family was a verb, not just a noun, when your first cousins were basically extra siblings. In that cemetery are buried Mittie, her husband, her children, her sister Laura and her husband, and their brother David Calvin and his wife. There are also other surnames on tombstones that I recognized as being related to Mittie. In that cemetery are buried 32 Civil War veterans, 12 World War I veterans, 70 veterans of World War II, 22 from the Korean conflict, and 6 from Vietnam. Oh, and 1 who fought in the Spanish-American War. All in one small, insignificant cemetery that most people have never heard of, on a 2-lane road lined with verdant pastures and ancient trees in an out-of-the-way place. But it not only tells the story of that community, it also tells the story of America. In all the backwoods towns across the country, there are cemeteries like this, full of different races, different religions, all living average, ordinary lives, making sacrifices for those they love, beating all the odds, and living to be 100. And maybe some of the people buried in those cemeteries made beautiful works of art that most people will never see. And in each one of those towns is a woman like Mittie Barrier, who saw the invention of automobiles along with telephones, electricity, movies, airplanes, radio, television, man's first steps on the moon, the Great Depression, and 4 wars. And in the end, it was her home, her garden, the animals, and her family that Mittie chose to immortalize in thread. This podcast was written, researched, and edited by me, Loretta Allen. You can find Seems Like History on Instagram and YouTube. That's Seems Like History, SEAMS. Textiles are perishable, so it is of the utmost importance that these old quilts be documented and preserved. Let's give a voice to those ghosts from the past. Join me next time when I take us to St. Louis, Missouri, my hometown, on the banks of the Mississippi River, and I take a look at an amazing high-style crazy quilt made by one of the city's society belles, Carrie Carson McWilliams.